make Melissa as a co-host, please.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank you on behalf of the organizing committee for being here today for our agent-based modeling for public health speaker series. I am Mahdi Najafabadi, and my colleagues and Sifal York will be facilitating this session today. I have studied my PhD in University at Albany, and I have a research affiliation with York University, where I work on plenty of agent-based models. Our speaker today is Melissa Tracy. Dr. Melissa Tracy, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Melissa Tracy is an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology in University at Albany's School of Public Health. She received her PhD in epidemiology from University of Michigan, and her Master of Public Health in Epidemiology from University of Washington. She also completed postdoctoral training in agent-based modeling at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. Her research focused on the social determinants of mental health, substance use, and violence across the life course. Dr. Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much everyone for joining and for inviting me to participate in this session. I've been trying to attend the previous sessions, and it has been very interesting, all of the work that is being done here. So it's nice to be able to be a part of this as well. Okay, so what I've noticed in a lot of the past sessions is that they focus on infectious disease modeling, which is not the kind of modeling that I do, although it's quite related, as you'll see from the examples that I'll provide. But what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of a little bit of a broad overview of applying agent-based modeling to study violence and trauma. And I'll show some case examples of the work that I've participated in and really discuss kind of some of the challenges, but also the opportunities in this area. So because it's a little bit different, I'm keeping it a little bit at a high level, but I'm very happy to also discuss more details of the models if you have more questions beyond what I'm showing on my slides. So this is an overview of what I plan to discuss today. I'll start by just thinking about why we decided to use agent-based modeling to study violence and trauma, and what we've learned so far from the models that we've done, and just touch a little bit on broader models in the literature. So I'll be discussing some specific examples from an agent-based model based on the New York City population. And then I will use that to illustrate some of the challenges that we've run into in applying agent-based modeling in this space, as well as opportunities and sort of future research directions that I think will help move us forward using this approach in this field. So some of the advantages that agent-based modeling have brought to the study of violence and trauma really stem from specific properties of violence and trauma as things that are really spatially and socially determined, right? So we know that both violence and trauma cluster in space and in social networks, and that relationships between people and their environment are very determinative of people's exposure to violence and trauma, as well as their responses to violence and trauma. So we really need an approach that can allow us to capture those interpersonal interactions and other kind of multi-level influences that are operating and are dynamic over time. Although exposure to violence is very patterned by sociodemographic and other factors, we also know that there is a very wide heterogeneity in people's exposure to violence and trauma, as well as their responses to violence and trauma. And so we really want to be able to capture that heterogeneity in the methods that we're using. And so agent-based modeling is one approach that allows us to capture that heterogeneity. And then, of course, we're very interested in identifying intervention strategies and really understanding how they should be targeted and implemented, and how that needs to play out to maximize our ability to reduce both, both to prevent violence and trauma, but also to reduce the consequences that they have when they occur. And so those are some of the primary motivations that led our group and others to use agent-based modeling for applications in trauma and violence. So I would say that, compared to something like infectious disease modeling, agent-based modeling in trauma and violence really is at a much lower level in terms of frequency of it being used, but it's definitely something that's been increasing. And some of the major applications that we've been seeing over the last, I would say like 2 decades or so, have really been some of these key questions here. So trying to use agent-based modeling to compare different interventions to reduce the mental health consequences of violence and trauma exposure after both kind of individual exposures to violence as well as more mass traumatic events like hurricanes and other disasters. Using agent-based modeling to evaluate the impact of social support and social networks in the context of trauma, really aiding decision-making in the context of mass disasters. So understanding how do we need to distribute resources after a disaster? What impacts that? What impacts does it have? How can we use this modeling to really understand access to services and really facilitate recovery after these types of events? And then agent-based modeling also has a long history of use in disaster preparedness. So understanding, how to plan for different evacuation routes, how to identify communities that are vulnerable to flooding, things like that, or other areas. But because my research really focuses on violence, I'm mostly going to focus on the violence applications and not so much other mass trauma and other disaster related applications of agent-based modeling. And when it comes to violence, obviously there's many different ways that we can approach and study violence, and different disciplines have different methods and different perspectives on it. And so there really has been kind of 2 streams of agent-based modeling when it comes to violence. So on one side is the side that I'm part of, so the epidemiology public health approach in using agent-based modeling to study community violence. And those applications have really focused more on comparing strategies to reduce the population burden of violence. And then we have kind of the approach from the criminal justice, criminology kind of side. And that really is one part of a larger field of computational criminology. And the questions that those agent-based models have really focused on have been a little bit different than what we look at in public health and epidemiology. Those tend to be more focused on using agent-based modeling to understand how different criminological theories play out and which ones might be most appropriate in different contexts for different types of crimes and things like that. So this table on the side here is from a paper that looked at how agent-based modeling is being used in criminology to study different types of theories. So I think there's a little more room for overlap between these 2 streams, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. Okay, but the examples that I'm going to focus on are work that I was part of, first as a doctoral student, then as a postdoc, and it has kind of branched out in different directions since then, which I'll talk about more later. But this really centers on an agent-based model of community violence among adults in New York City. And we started with a very basic model that I'll show a little bit in a second. And we've really been able to use this model and expand this model to look at several different research questions. And so I'm going to kind of show the evolution of the model and the research questions that we've tried to answer using this model. So we started looking at neighborhood influences on violence and how the neighborhood context might influence the effectiveness of community level interventions. And I'll show the results from that in a second. We then went on to use the model to try to understand how best to reduce the mental health consequences of violence exposure, as well as different strategies that could be most effective in preventing violence, whether public health community-based strategies versus more law enforcement, criminal justice-based strategies. Then we started incorporating different aspects of behavior so we could specifically focus on alcohol-related violence rather than just sort of a broader scope of community violence. And we looked at different strategies to reduce alcohol-related violence. And then the model has expanded in some other directions that I'll show as well shortly. But just to give an overview of this model, so this is an agent-based model simulating the adult New York City population. Because New York City has a very large population, we chose to simulate a 5% sample to keep our model sort of computationally reasonable. And these adults are embedded in New York City neighborhoods, which I'll show, and had a number of characteristics. So sociodemographic characteristics, sex, age, race, ethnicity, education, income, as well as the primary behaviors that are happening in the model are these experiences of violence. So agents could be a victim of violence, could engage in a violent offense, and could also witness violence happening in the model. And I'll show some examples of how that kind of plays out. So this is what our population looked like. We were using the New York City 2000 population from US Census data, because a lot of our data sources were based in the 2000s, and we wanted to be able to run the model up to kind of the present time. And I'll talk a little bit about our time scale in a second as well. So you can see that, we had a population that matched what we expected in terms of the distribution of these different sociodemographic characteristics based on census data. As I mentioned, our adults were embedded in New York City neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that we used are called community districts. And these are sort of meaningful representative neighborhoods, the Lower East Side, Park Slope in Brooklyn, names that you might recognize if you've been to New York City or from here. There's 59 community districts in the city. So they are rather large areas compared to some other studies, but we felt like this was reflective of the scale of some of the community level influences that we felt were important in this model of violence. And for our model, we weren't as concerned with having a very realistic representation of the environment. We felt it was important that our neighborhoods were realistic in the sense of population density and location. So in terms of neighborhoods that neighbored each other, were adjacent to each other, that was important, but we didn't actually use a GIS representation of space in this model. We instead converted the neighborhoods to this grid that was a little bit easier to work with computationally. And so you can see if you look back and forth to the map of the grid, the area in terms of the grid matches the neighborhood land area. And then we assigned agents to the neighborhoods based on their sociodemographic characteristics so that the population within each neighborhood matched what we expected based on US Census data. And we also maintained that population density across the neighborhoods. Okay. So in our original iteration of the model, it was really quite simple. We have these agents embedded in neighborhoods, only adults. And in addition to being embedded in neighborhoods, we also had a very simple social network in the neighborhood. So agents were matched to other agents as their friends based on some similarities in their characteristics and geographic proximity and things like that. And we felt that was really important to include in a model of community violence where peer influences can play a strong role and really impact how violence plays out in certain situations, which I'll talk about in a second. So how does violence actually occur in this model? Basically, everyone in the model, all the agents have a certain probability of being a victim of violence and of engaging in a violent offense at every time step. And those probabilities are based on their individual characteristics, as well as their prior history of violence, characteristics of the neighborhood that they live in, and the violence experiences of their social network members. Since we know that violence clusters in social networks, we wanted to be able to capture that. But in order for, so everyone has this probability of violence, basically, a coin is flipped in the model to determine whether someone is actually a potential victim or perpetrator. But in order for violence to actually occur, the victim, the potential victim and the potential perpetrator need to geographically connect in the model. So they need to be close enough in order for that violent act to actually occur. And that's just a way of trying to represent that interpersonal violence requires, more than one person to happen, and wanted to make sure that that connection was somewhat realistic in the model. And once the violence occurs, nearby folks can also witness it and have that be something that influences their own risk later on in different ways. And so having the social network impact in there also enabled us to capture some aspects of community violence that are particularly important, like retaliation. So having someone in your network be a victim of violence is then going to increase your own risk of both being a victim and a perpetrator. So we tried to capture some kind of known dynamics about community violence. So a couple logistic details on this model. We used Repast as our modeling software, and the time step in this model is a year. So that's quite different from a lot of the infectious disease models in terms of the time span that we're thinking about. And the reason, I'll talk a little more about this as the reason for it, as well as limitations for it. A lot of the data sources that we're using, which are partly summarized here, are survey data and administrative data, and the scale of available data on violent experiences in a very small time scale is quite limited. And so we wanted to try to capture sort of more global patterns of violence across time, which had sort of advantages and disadvantages in this model, but that was the decision that we made, just so that's clear. And so as you can see, a lot of the data sources that we're using are US-based sources. We tried to use New York City-based sources when possible for a few things that we didn't have available data specific to New York City. We also used national data, but tried to limit it to folks in urban areas to at least try to replicate the dynamics that might be more relevant to New York City. Okay, so some of the questions that I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just going to present kind of briefly here just to give a broader scope of what we've learned so far from using this model. So as I mentioned, one of the first questions that we asked with this model was how community level interventions could reduce population levels of violence, as well as racial ethnic inequalities in violence, and how kind of structural characteristics of neighborhoods could limit that effectiveness. So for this model, we were really focused on just the basic violence dynamics that I've already presented, but really thinking about some neighborhood interventions and with a specific focus on neighborhood collective efficacy, which is really this idea that neighborhoods can kind of come together and be cohesive and affect change if needed and sort of have social norms and behaviors in a neighborhood. This is something that has been strongly shown to be associated with community levels of violence. And so the goal in this use of the agent-based model was to simulate interventions that would increase neighborhood collective efficacy. And we had different experimental scenarios in the model where we compared a universal intervention where all neighborhoods would receive this intervention to increase neighborhood collective efficacy and how that influenced community levels of violence, as well as interventions that were targeted to the highest violence neighborhoods, and compared those different strategies. And somewhat intuitively, as you would expect, perhaps the universal interventions we found reduced the population levels of violent victimization more than the interventions that were targeted to the highest violence neighborhoods, even though we have this strong spatial clustering of violence in New York City. However, neither of the intervention approaches, neither universal nor targeted, had any impact on the very strong racial ethnic inequalities and violence that we see in New York City. So in the US, we have these very disproportionate rates of violence among communities of color compared to white populations. And that obviously is seen in New York City as well. And these interventions, even when targeting kind of the highest violence communities, inequalities were unchanged. And so we did a little bit more simulation modeling with our agent-based model and really found that the very strong residential segregation patterns in New York City were really hampering the ability of these interventions to impact inequalities. And as long as those structural residential segregation patterns were in place, these interventions have no effect on racial ethnic inequalities, which we felt was an important thing to be able to really visualize and present and explore a little bit through this model. Okay, so for our second use of this model, we went on to explore how best to reduce mental health consequences of violence exposure, and particularly looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a result of violence. So we know that folks who are exposed to violence, it has one of the highest conditional probabilities of PTSD compared to other types of traumatic events in terms of how likely it is to lead to PTSD as a consequence. So we incorporated PTSD symptoms based on some survey data that we have for New York City adults. And we looked at two different intervention strategies. So one was to think about how do we prevent the violence from happening, and I'll talk about what we chose in this iteration as a violence prevention strategy. And the second was, what if we focused on treating the folks who have violence-related post-traumatic stress disorder? Because as you can see from this model, having violence-related post-traumatic stress disorder, not only does it increase your risk of continued mental health issues moving forward, but it also increases your risk of further violent victimization, which we know is a strong relationship that has been found in many studies. So we chose to implement cognitive behavioral therapy, or really increase access to effective cognitive behavioral therapy for violence-related PTSD in the model. So here we were expanding the model to include police officers, because one of the strategies that we were implementing to prevent violence was hotspots community policing. So this is controversial in many ways, and I'll talk more about that in the next set of questions that we looked at. But some studies have found that targeted policing to areas with highest rates of crime can be effective in reducing crime. And so that was the one strategy that we decided to implement in this model. So now the violence dynamics are changing just slightly, where if a police officer who's shown in green on this slide is present nearby, it can actually prevent sort of that interaction between a potential victim and perpetrator in the model, and thus decrease violence from actually occurring in this way. Okay, so when we compared these two strategies, this population level intervention of trying to prevent violence through hotspots policing versus an individual level intervention where we were increasing this access to cognitive behavioral therapy for folks who had violence-related PTSD, thus decreasing their PTSD symptoms, shortening the duration that they had PTSD, which would then kind of go on to influence their risk of violence subsequently. We really didn't find that either strategy really changed the prevalence of violence-related PTSD in the model very much. However, there were much stronger effects if you combined the two approaches together than using either approach alone. And so really kind of highlighting kind of what we always say in violence, that you really need a comprehensive strategy, right? One thing is not going to affect a lot of change, and you really want to think about what strategies work best together and really allow you to do more and have a greater impact with less resources as well. So we were able to illustrate that with the results of that version of the model. So recognizing that there's a lot of issues with hotspots policing and a lot of interest in alternatives to law enforcement-based approaches to violence prevention, our next version of the model really focused on comparing the hotspots policing intervention that we previously mentioned to more community-based public health approaches. And here we were simulating community violence intervention. In the US, we often refer to it as cure violence. So this is the idea that you have folks working as street outreach workers, conflict mediators in the communities. So these are folks from the communities, have a lot of knowledge, serve as credible messengers in the communities, and work with youth and other folks who are at high risk of participating in violence to try to reduce their risk, as well as mediate conflicts, prevent retaliation, sort of when things are brewing in the community. So in this version of the model, we incorporated an additional entity, which are now agents who were specifically mapped out as street outreach workers and conflict mediators in the model. And so their role in this violence dynamics was similar to the police officers. The conflict mediators could directly intervene and prevent a violent act from occurring. The outreach workers could also reduce the probability of violence among kind of a certain subset who are identified as their participants in the model to reduce their risk of violence as well. And so when we implemented these two interventions, we found that we could see some larger effects in terms of reducing annual violent victimization in the model. And so if we implemented the community violence intervention, so this cure violence simulation, for 10 years, we were able to decrease annual violent victimization by 13%, whereas in order to get a similar effect using a law enforcement-based approach, we would need to implement hotspots policing and double the police force, and assume that everything is working great as it's supposed to be and nothing, unintended is happening there for 10 years. And so this really highlighted the advantages of community-based violence interventions, which is something that's getting a lot more attention now as well. And here also we highlighted that combining the strategies would also produce much greater reductions in violence over a shorter period of time, requiring less resources. So again, really just emphasizing this need for a comprehensive approach to violence prevention and being able to illustrate it and visualize it with the model. Okay, so the last set of examples that I'll talk about before moving on to think about some challenges and opportunities in this area is starting to incorporate alcohol-related violence specifically. So here we needed to be able to incorporate drinking behaviors in a way that kind of made sense. And so we also added an additional entity to our model, which were alcohol outlets. So these were both off-premise and on-premise outlets. And we needed these to really be able to replicate patterns of drinking in the model and how the drinking context influences behaviors as well as violence. And so let's see, we also incorporated, drinking directly in the models. This is a new behavior that our agents had, and individuals' probabilities of drinking were influenced by, not only their own sociodemographic characteristics, their neighborhood characteristics, the drinking behaviors of their social network members, as well as folks who they would interact with at their preferred alcohol outlet. And so this really captures some of the dynamics that go on in a more realistic way. And then, now some of the events that are happening, the violent events that are happening, are being classified as alcohol-related violence, that we're able to look at alcohol-related violence specifically and simulate interventions that are targeting alcohol-related violence. So in two papers, we looked at two different types of strategies. One was a taxation strategy. We tried kind of a universal taxation on all alcohol of different amounts, as well as specifically a beer tax. And we did find that taxation was able to decrease heavy drinking, but it only led to pretty small reductions in alcohol-related violence specifically. In our second paper, we also tried limiting alcohol outlet density. So we know that, areas where there's a lot of alcohol outlets clustered also tend to have more alcohol-related violence. So we tried kind of capping the alcohol outlet density at different levels in the model, which really didn't have any impact, and also closing outlets where violence was happening, which is a strategy that's commonly used. It's happened in Albany recently, a bar that police was called a certain number of times, right? They take the license away for a little while. But we really found that this also did not produce changes in alcohol use or alcohol-related violence. So this strategy doesn't seem like the best approach to be used in isolation to really have an impact on alcohol-related violence. Okay, so just a summary of what I just discussed from this model. Some of the things that we learned were the importance of neighborhood influences on violence, as well as intervention effectiveness at the community level. Sorry, I meant to put that here. Improving neighborhood conditions may not be sufficient to reduce community violence, given structural factors like residential segregation that continue to maintain those inequalities that we see. Combined investment in prevention and treatment is important for the mental health consequences of violence, and combined investment in community-based and criminal justice approaches is also critical for violence prevention. And as I just said, taxation may help reduce risky drinking behaviors, but reducing alcohol outlet density alone may not be sufficient. So what are some of the challenges that we've run into in applying agent-based modeling, specifically to violence, but this kind of has broader applications in the trauma literature as well. So one, as I mentioned, is really the availability of data. So we know that, violence data, we're using mostly survey and administrative data to parameterize our model. And obviously there's a lot of underreporting of certain types of violence and crimes, and a lot of issues with relying on data in that way, which is, makes it quite challenging. Obviously, we did a lot of calibration and sensitivity analyses to try to make sure that things looked the way we expected in terms of what we know about patterns of violence, but we did struggle with trying to find data that was reliable and most useful in parameterizing some of these things, which led partly to our use of a one-year timescale, which I also mentioned, so as a limitation. So, although we are capturing sort of these broader dynamics of over a one-year period, someone's risk for heavy drinking and violence, it's important to understand that. But at the same time, a lot of violence is very situational, and particularly when you're looking at something like alcohol as a risk factor, that's really something that you want to be able to situate in a very more nuanced kind of time scale that would be a little bit more appropriate, a day, much more a smaller time scale. So this is an area where we're seeing a lot more data being collected on violence using, ecologic momentary assessments and daily diaries and things like that to really understand the risk of different types of violent events happening. So I think we'll be able to incorporate that more as we move forward. And we are moving in that direction of trying to scale the time scale down so that we have a better ability to understand what's going on, and also implement interventions that depend more on, really being in that time and not looking at these more global one-year kind of trends and patterns. In addition to some of the interventions that we were operationalizing in the model, we also don't have great data on their effectiveness, or some of the data is coming from observational studies, and how good is that data to really understand what the intervention effectiveness might look like in these different situations. And we did a lot of sensitivity analyses to really think about, even if it was, more effective, if we're underestimating the effectiveness or if we're overestimating it, how does that change the results that we see? So we have an ability to sort of look at that and try to understand intervention fidelity and how that impacts results. And that's the one great thing about using the modeling, because you can do all that kind of stuff, but we still don't have necessarily the best data to really understand what those interventions might look like. And the last issue that we've run into in sort of applying agent-based modeling in this realm of violence and more social epidemiology is really a lack of workforce and having kind of that modeling capacity. I mean, I think, some US universities are really trying to move towards creating this pipeline of individuals who are trained in these methods, but in a lot of ways, we're not quite there yet. It certainly is increasing, but I don't think we have, especially compared to like thinking about more infrastructure and capabilities for infectious disease modeling. I think we're a little behind on that in this area. And at the same time, as I'll discuss more in my next slide, we really need a lot of interdisciplinary perspectives when we're dealing with something like violence, because there's so many different ways that you can think about it. And there's so many factors that impact violence that you want to be representing as much as possible in your model, but it really becomes challenging to create kind of a shared language among everyone on your team and come to a consensus on what should be included when you have folks from so many different areas. And so just really thinking about how best to go about that team building process and creating this capacity for modeling has been something that we are definitely still working on in this area. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunities and things that we can learn from applying agent-based modeling in this space. So as I mentioned, our model was really focused on adults. And so we're not looking at both the occurrence of violence and the impacts of violence on kids and adolescents, which I think is kind of the direction that we need to go. And I'll talk about our research directions in that area in a second. But we really know that a lot of these impacts of violence, start at a very young age, being exposed to violence, and it can also extend intergenerationally. And so it's really important that we represent that and think about how that's playing out and how that will also impact the effectiveness of these different interventions that we're interested in. And we also know that childhood exposure to violence not only has kind of behavioral and social influences and consequences, but can also alter things like stress reactivity and other biological mechanisms that then subsequently go on to impact someone's risk and vulnerability to violence in the future. And so being able to incorporate that and really take advantage of agent-based modeling and its ability to capture multiple levels, I think is an important next step. So we're working on that as well. Going back to my initial comment on computational criminology and how they really focus on theory, and we haven't as much in epidemiology and public health when it comes to violence, I think we have an opportunity to really incorporate some of that theory work in the models and reflect kind of what we know about how violence occurs in different settings and the importance of that to understanding intervention effectiveness as well. I think we also have an opportunity to incorporate different hybrid modeling approaches. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And also, particularly when it comes to thinking about community violence, really having a community engaged approach to model development. So what's becoming more common in this space is using participatory group model building to engage a lot of different stakeholders in the community in the model development process. Sometimes this is more often used in system dynamics modeling, but it's becoming more commonly used in agent-based modeling as well. And really make sure that, it's not just us as academics who think we know what's happening with community violence and the way that interventions would play out, but we're really getting input and making a model that not only reflects what's happening in the communities, but is useful to the communities and the questions that we're asking and the way that the model is being used. And so I think that is a direction that we are moving in as well. So a lot of these ideas, we're really trying to promote the use of agent-based modeling in trauma research. So we have a paper that's under review where a lot of these ideas are kind of explicated and trying to serve kind of as a gateway into agent-based modeling for folks who maybe haven't been involved in it before, but we really want to bring in those perspectives from trauma researchers and practitioners who would have a lot to add to the way that we're doing this work. Okay, so I'll just close with a couple of final thoughts on kind of the directions that we've been going. So I mentioned all of these previous work that we did on this New York City-based model. And so I kind of, moved on to a faculty position after my postdoc. And so this work has continued in two different streams. So one is really incorporating specifically firearm-related violence, as well as firearm-related suicide, and really looking at different firearm restrictions and different policies and strategies that could be used to reduce firearm-related violence. And you'll see some of those papers coming out shortly. And then the stream that kind of I've taken in my lab here at the University of Albany is really to focus on family violence. And so some of the things that we're doing in that realm is first to really understand what is being done in the whole kind of systems science space related to family violence, specifically domestic and gender-based violence, but we're also interested in understanding what's happening with child maltreatment as well. So we're currently conducting a systematic review, looking not just at agent-based modeling, but also system dynamics modeling and network analysis, and more conceptual approaches, systems mapping, general systems thinking kind of processes that have been applied to domestic violence. And now we're expanding our New York City model to try to incorporate both child maltreatment, domestic violence, other types of family violence. So we're including children and adolescents in the model, not just adults, embedding them in households, incorporating some of these biological processes that I mentioned, which I think are really important mechanisms that help violence kind of be transmitted from parents to children and kind of across generations. Really trying to capture some of the connections between family and community violence. A lot of times we see, the same communities that are experiencing high levels of community violence also have high levels of family violence, and understanding kind of how that plays out and what that means for interventions and other prevention activities that need to be happening. And then we're testing interventions targeted to different stages of the life course, given that we have kids incorporated in the model. And then the last point I'll just touch on here, we also know that violence has increased a lot during the COVID-19 pandemic, community violence, gun violence, domestic violence, all of it. And so really wanting to account for that in our models and see how we can use agent-based modeling to best understand those increases and think about how they can best be addressed, if we can shed some light on that through this work. So this is some of the ways that we've expanded our conceptual model. As you can see, we've incorporated biological processes that we didn't have before in the original New York City-based model, and really focusing on the relationship between victims and offenders and how violence might look different when it's occurring in a household versus in the community, and different types of relationships matter. So really wanting to get deeper into that to understand the mechanisms and the interventions. Some of the data sources that we're using for this model really come from longitudinal data sources that have collected information over long periods of time. So we have a lot of the different life stages represented, but also have multiple reporters. So not just relying on one self-report, although we are still, this is a tricky thing, particularly data on family violence is not super easy to come by and super reliable. So there's some challenges there as well. And these are some of the interventions that we're expanding to be able to look at impacts on family violence and sort of how that changes the course of violence over time. So interventions that are targeted to different stages of childhood, to children themselves, to parents, a lot of the kind of general things that we think about in terms of violence prevention, and then obviously different combinations of these approaches as well. Okay, so I'll just wrap up with some conclusions. Agent-based modeling, I hope I have demonstrated how it has highlighted the need for a comprehensive approach to violence specifically, including simultaneous implementation of different kinds of programs that are aimed at prevention, treatment, addressing structural factors, etc. We feel that interdisciplinary community engaged teams are really critical to modeling violence and trauma, and that agent-based modeling can be an important complement to other methodologies for understanding violence and trauma and their population impacts. I'll just highlight my collaborators on this work, both from my training as well as in my lab currently. And thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So we have one question in the Q&A area. While you can go over that and let's see the question. I want to invite everyone who has a question. They can raise hands and we can give them the mic for them to ask questions. We have two questions from the panelists as well. So you can start by answering the question in the Q&A, and then we will go over the panelists' question and anyone else if there were any.
Sure. All right. So Martin has a question here about bringing in real world data where it existed, for example, effective minimum pricing of alcohol in Scotland. So thank you for that question, Martin. Yes. We didn't actually include price data directly in the model. Rather, we used information on price elasticity. So really thinking about sort of what the relative drinking patterns and consumption would be if price changed by certain amounts based on price elasticities. And that's how we tried to incorporate. And that was using different literature and meta-analyses that have been done on the impact or price elasticity of other studies that have looked at taxation, and then sort of letting that play out in the model.
Thank you very much. Michael, can you go forward with your question, please?
Sure. First, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and a demonstration of how what starts as a you know, I wouldn't say simple, but, you know, you can fit on one page kind of model to, it took 2 pages by the time you came to the end. One question is, my sense is that it's been a challenge over the years to get papers that use agent-based modeling published in journals like AJPH and things like that. So one question is, how have you fared with the reviewers? I assume one of the questions they ask is validation. So that's one question. I have a couple, but I'll just ask one other, which is, you talked about racial segregation at one point, but I didn't hear anything. I think income was one of your variables, but I didn't hear anything about poverty. And I know in the US that everybody thinks that the most important kind of discrimination is racial, but there's a lot of evidence when you actually look at it that it's income that's more important than race, and income segregated neighborhoods as opposed to racially segregated neighborhoods.
Thank you for that question. So I'm going to take the second one first, since it's freshest in my mind. So I should have said this. So we actually looked at segregation by both race and income in the model, and how that, so first we have sort of the realistic kind of existing pattern of where people live in New York City and how that's patterned by both race and income. And then what we actually did was change the environment. So if we remove segregation by both race and income, it's just randomly put people in a location, how that impacts the effectiveness of those community level interventions. And if you change segregation by different amounts on both the axis of race and income, what you see in terms of that intervention effectiveness, because I think it's important to be looking at both. And we also do incorporate, as a sociodemographic characteristics, we do have information on income for folks, and then also think about as their probabilities of violence are playing out, those are influenced by not only the neighborhood levels of violence, but also by neighborhood income, because that's something that continues to play out in both people's exposure to violence, but also rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and other things in the model. So we did incorporate both of those directly.
And the reviewers?
Yes, and the reviewers, great question. So I would say that we have been able to be fairly successful in getting our papers published in sort of mainstream public health epidemiology journals. We do have a lot of critiques that we need to respond to once we submit. So one thing that we do for all of our models is describe them using the ODD protocol, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. So this is the overview, design, I was going to forget the name of it, overview, design concepts, and details, I think is the acronym. And so we really have a very hefty appendix with all of our models that gives a lot more detail than we can fit. Because I think one of the challenges a lot of times is that you can only provide so much information in your paper. And so the reviewers might have additional questions just because of word limits, right? And so we want to have a place where we can give a lot more detail on the decisions that we made, assumptions that went into it, data sources, equations, everything, pseudocode, flowcharts that kind of describe the whole process of modeling. So that has been helpful, I think, in being able to point to where that information is and how it is captured. But yeah, validation is definitely an issue. You know, with our models, it's very difficult. We barely have enough data to parameterize the model, much less have an independent data source to actually use for validation. And so a lot of times we do include a range of sensitivity analyses as one way of at least kind of providing some information on internal validation and how changing parameters, you know, what impact that has on the results or doesn't have on the results, so that we can give a little bit more confidence in the results that we're getting. But I would agree, like that is a big pushback that we get. But I think, you know, I think that as time has gone on, the use of these modeling approaches has definitely become a little bit more accepted. And so being really transparent about our assumptions and things like that, I think has been helpful in getting us over the hurdle of getting published.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Wade, can you go forward with your question, please?
Hi, thanks for this talk. My question is, I'm wondering if you could say some more about how your agents were networked and what kind of data you used to inform that networking.
Sure, absolutely. So as I mentioned, we had a pretty simple strategy here for the social network, and we used data from the General Social Survey, which is a national survey in the US that asks a lot of questions about people's friendships, their close ties. We don't have actual social network data that we're using to parameterize it. So we're using in our model, we have a process at the start of the model where agents are linked to other agents based on demographic characteristics, so age, sex, race, ethnicity, income, and then by geographic distance. And it's really quite simple. Like, we're really looking for, you know, most of your friends are going to be within a certain range of age of you, and kind of most of your friends are going to be similar to you. And that was really just based on kind of what we know about similarity between folks. But it's pretty simple. There's a lot more that we could do with it, but we felt like it was sufficient for the process of really understanding how drinking behavior kind of clusters in social networks and violence clusters in social networks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wade.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other raised hands, but there are two questions in the Q&A part. I think I saw Chris raised hands, but maybe his question was answered while you were answering other questions. And also Ali has a question. So we can go to the Q&A. If you could answer Martin's question, please.
Sure, yeah. So Martin asks, with both compartmental and agent-based infectious disease models, there's a move to making the models behind publication available publicly, for example, through GitHub. Is this happening in this area? And I would say yes. So we have started to make our code available through GitHub, but probably not for the models that I showed. It's more in the more recent papers that are coming out now. We certainly we have shared our code with others when asked, but I think it hasn't been a requirement of publication in a lot of the journals that we publish in. But I definitely understand the importance of transparency and reproducibility and sharing. So it's starting to happen, and we're happy to participate in that movement as well, and encourage others to do that as well. And a lot of the talks that I give and in the training that I do for folks on agent-based modeling, we talk a lot about kind of standardizing the way that we both develop our models and disseminate our models, and so that they can be understood and evaluated and replicated by others. And I think that's a really important thing as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Ali, can you ask your question, please?
Sure, thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa, for a great presentation. For me, it was quite interesting as I do some work on this area. Not, of course, using agent-based modeling so far. My question is about the technical aspect, perhaps. When you mentioned future directions of your research and work, are you also thinking of using or changing your software tool? I noticed that you're using Repast, and that's basically the question. What kind of future direction you see in the type of software you are using for your model?
Yeah, sure. So our original model was built on an older version of Repast. So we have switched over to using Repast Symphony, which is kind of the more recent currently supported version of Repast. We have talked about switching over to NetLogo. NetLogo is what I use when I teach students about agent-based modeling. It's a little bit more intuitive and kind of has a lower kind of startup cost. But for the time being, we have continued to use Repast Symphony for our violence model.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Michael, you can go forward.
Thanks. I can't resist commenting on the last point. I was involved in building a model, and I started in NetLogo, and as soon as we got beyond 5,000 agents, it broke. So we had to switch to something else. We've been using the Statistics Canada language. Two more questions, if I may. The time step of 1 year, I think you mentioned, is rather long. So what's your intuition about what is the impact of using such a long time step rather than monthly or weekly? Yeah. And the other question is you showed very nicely the evolution of your, what I'll call, for want of a better phrase, box and arrow diagrams. I've forgotten the name of the lady who talks about, have you seen the web of causality? But there is, for example, in CISNET, the Cancer Intervention and Surveillance Network, the practice there is to have half a dozen independent teams each build their own model. And one of the reasons is to get at it's a generalization of the concept of specification error, to say that different people are going to come at the same questions and write down a different box and arrow diagram, or put different things in the arrows. So what's your thought or reaction to the sensitivity of your results to the particular specification you used for the box and arrow diagrams.
Great. Okay, great questions. Thank you, Michael. So I'll answer the second one first again. So in terms of our box and arrow diagrams, I think that's a great point. I mean, we do use a lot of consultation and collaboration in coming up with those models. But I think you're right that there are instances where you could specify them in a different way, or include an arrow or not include an arrow, you know, that we have included. One of the things that we do during our sensitivity analyses is you know, think about the effect of those different decisions that we've made in the modeling process. And if you take some things out, you know, how does it change your results? But I think that is a bigger issue. And I think that's where something like a group model building process, where you can engage a lot of different folks who work in this area and have different perspectives on what it looks like and how things might play out and the mechanisms that are involved, I think is really critical, because there are things that, you know, we think there's an arrow there. Do we know for sure there's an arrow there? I don't know. And so really, you know, being able to include a diversity of perspectives, I think is important, and really being able to also kind of test the robustness of our results given those different assumptions, I think is important. So I think we've done good with testing the robustness, but I think we could do more with really exploring alternative ways that those diagrams could look and how that might play out. So I think that's important. So yeah, thank you for that point. Your other question was about the time step. So yes, so 1 year time step. I mean, I think it really limits our ability to look at situational factors and how they affect violence. And also when you're looking at things like mental health and substance use, you know, you might see general patterns over a year, but at the same time, a lot of things are very episodic. I don't know if that's right to say that word, but you know, things fluctuate, right? And when you're thinking about something like, especially moving into using the model to look at suicide, I think that's an area where there's a lot of fluctuation in the nature of suicide risk, and being able to capture that using a 1 year time scale, I think is, I think you're quite limited there. And so I think depending on the question that you're asking, I think it can sometimes be okay to have a longer time scale for some of the questions that we want to ask and we really want to be able to understand. I think we definitely need to move down to a lower level.
Thank you very much. So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions if any of the audience have questions to ask. If not, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you and thank everyone for attending this session. It was wonderful. We hope to see you again in when we plan for the rest of these speaker series. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Melissa, for a great presentation. And yes, that is going to be our last session on June 3rd with our own Wade McDonald talking about agent-based modeling, simulation and modeling with some examples. Till then, you have a great time, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending this session as usual.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.